Welcome everyone to today's Title Topics webinar. These are ALTA's free presentations that we offer every month on issues important to title professionals. I'm Jeremy Yowie, ALTA's Vice President of Communications, and today we've got a fantastic webinar planned for today that's going to dig into some key things that should be considered if you're entertaining thoughts on exiting the industry. Before starting, I just need to touch on a few housekeeping items. A copy of today's presentation was emailed earlier today to all registrants. If you didn't receive it, please shoot me an email at jyohe@alta.org. Again, that's jyohe@alta.org, and I will send you a copy after the webinar. And you should be able to download the presentation under the Handouts tab. If you didn't get it, you can get it there as well. As an added benefit, today's presentation is being recorded. After it's processed, the recording will be available on ALTA's website at alta.org/title topics, and the web address is there on the screen on the slide. I need to thank Fidelity for sponsoring our Title Topics webinars this year. Their support allows us to continue providing these educational opportunities free of charge. And with that out of the way, let me briefly introduce today's speakers. First, we have Bill Blincoe. Bill is president and owner of Blincoe Enterprises. This is a consulting firm specializing in the installation, training, and use of title industry software for title agents and underwriters. Bill has experience in working with agents at all stages, whether opening a new agency, modifying and improving ongoing business practices, or concluding agent operations. Prior to creating his company, Bill worked for a national underwriter for 30 years. We also have Jonathan Yasko. Jonathan is the managing member of Entrust Solutions, a title insurance servicing company offering back office solutions for title agents, attorneys, and underwriters. And prior to starting Entrust in 2007, Jonathan spent time at Southern Title Insurance Corporation and Attorneys Title Insurance Fund. And also joining us is Ethan Powsner. Ethan is Vice President and Director of Compliance, Technology, and Market Development for Fidelity National Title Group. Ethan has worked in various aspects of the real estate and title insurance industry since 1984. And prior to his current role, Ethan served as agency manager in Ohio, Indiana, and Michigan. Ethan, I'll turn the presentation over to you to get us going.
Thank you, Jeremy. I'd like to start out to tell the listeners that we are not going to be following the slides word for word because you've been able to download them in the seminar or webinars being recorded. So Bill and Jonathan, let's get started. Since November, I've fielded about a dozen calls from agents looking to sell or merge their agencies. A number of them have had one or more conversations with potential partners, and the initial meetings have generally been positive. However, I have not heard that any of them have consummated a transaction. Given that both parties are aware of the potential opportunities created by making a deal, can you shed some light on why most of these potential deals are not closing and how this information can help an agent prepare an exit strategy?
Sure. Hey, Ethan, this is Jonathan with Entrust. What we have seen historically in this industry is title companies and law firms that do real estate settlements are really a cash flow based company. So when you go and you buy a company, if it's a manufacturing company, you're buying the inventory, you're buying the accounts receivable, you're buying the manufacturing aspects and what have you. But in title companies, the very most important thing is this is a business that is based upon relationships. So without a lack of relationship, there is no business there. So when you have a cash flow business, what we have seen historically as Entrust is we go into additional states and we have companies that merge into us and what have you. Most companies don't have profit and loss statements. They don't have balance sheets. They're mom and pop organizations or they're law firms where, when times are good, they can pay themselves salaries and bonuses. When times are bad, they're paying their employees and staff to stay on board. Coming up, over the great real estate depression that we just came into, we get to look at a lot of different scenarios in a lot of different states for different options out there for how to buy a company. In the next slide, one of the couple of things that we're going to go over with specifically are what type of options are there. So when you look at a cash flow business, especially businesses that don't have any type of hard assets or real property, for lack of better words, you have to look at ways to protect the buyer versus the seller and seller versus the buyer. I will tell you from our perspective, from the Entrust Solutions perspective, with companies that merge into us, we're looking at what they bring to the table and how to protect our interests for companies that merge into us. So on the screen in front of you, you have a couple of different options. There's the basic structured sale. That being said, Ethan, I'm going to kind of throw this back to your way. I have been involved in a lot of different particular matters, but for the actual real structured sale for title companies and what have you, I have yet to really see ones that go all the way through. Most companies think that, and it's just fine, it's their baby, that they're worth a gazillion dollars. Well, you have to really look at the bottom line. What type of revenue, what type of earned income, retained earnings, what type of real property they have, what can they do that's out there? From a seller's perspective, you also have, you could outsource. There's options of bringing investors in, different joint ventures with different companies out there to bring potential new business in the door. What we look at more particularly is the merger aspect or the acquisitions or branch office aspect. What can we do to help agencies and title companies, go over the next level, especially with CFPB's final rule coming about that's been moved back to October 1st, the physical security, internet security. There's a lot of hard dollars that's got to be spent before the first dollar of revenue comes in. If you're also able to get over that hump, you have different options out there for companies that are looking to merge, but then there's also the option of winding up the agency. One of the things I will bring up in particular is the fact that large companies are now merging with other large companies. Companies that are doing 500, 800, 1,000 closings are merging with like-kind 500, 800 to 1,000 closings a month companies, specifically because they're trying to be big enough to stay in business where the lender is saying, okay, well, we see you in these different aspects and we want to continue to do business with you. Which sort of brings us, what does a person really want to accomplish? What is their big aspect of what the next step is, which is going to be on the next slide in front of you.
And if I may step in for a minute, I think that I've seen the shorthand reference that our customers have talked about, which is we can't agree on the price. But that, like I said, is shorthand, and it really covers up a lot of the issues, including a lack of preparation and thought on what the plan is, either from how to structure a deal to protect the seller or the buyer, or on what's plan B. So,
correct.
And I'll add. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Jeff.
No, you're fine. I just wanted to kind of implement, and put that in there. Exactly that. You have to look at, and I know we have a slide about this coming up. Is really more so about what can a company do to look at the next transition, look at the next level. What do you want to accomplish? And again, Bill, I want to go ahead and throw this over to you because you represent the other side to the table. What we look at from a perspective of a merging agency is what do they have to bring to the table? What can we do to help bring them up, help them benefit to this? But Bill, I know yours is coming up here in regards to the different options that the people have when they wrap things up.
Right, and I'll add to what you've been saying and what Ethan has been saying. I think a lot of times it's more about setting and understanding expectations, and that's really what the next slide, I think, is getting to, and some of the next slides are getting to. What are your expectations, and do you and a potential buyer share each other's expectations? Do you understand each other's expectations? Because a buyer may be looking at it from the context of you being a valuable asset in an ongoing organization, where your expectation may be that you wish to no longer be doing this on a day-to-day basis. So I think that those expectations are really important. What is it that you're looking to accomplish? And along with that, what is your time frame? And here I think it's very important that everyone that would be considering doing something have a reasonable understanding of what the time frame might be. Title companies are not retail operations like a shoe store where you can send the inventory back from the basement and you're done. It can take a very, very long time to wind down a title company. So if your thought is you would like to be done in a 6-month time frame, that may not be a reasonable expectation. You may need to adjust that. It's probably at least 3 months to do any type of another transition once you get that transition defined. So we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail on some of the other slides. Primarily, one of the things that we'll touch on is what are the issues with ceasing the operation of a title company. But in your time frame, are you looking for something that would happen within a 3-year that would involve transitioning to employees? Or how is it that you're constructing your expectations? What is it that you want to do? Along with that, then, you probably need to be asking yourself the question, for a potential buyer, what's in it for them? What would they be looking at? What does my agency bring to the table that would be attractive to a potential buyer? And as Jonathan touched on, understand that these are businesses that you've built over time and that you're very, very attached to. It's not unlike selling a house. What would the buyer be looking at when the buyer comes into the house? Because that's what's going to be determining the price. So are you best practices compliant? Do you have some of the information that the buyer would be looking for? What is it that you're looking for out of the transaction? Are you looking to walk away? Are you looking to be a part of it? All of those play into the expectations for both yourself and any potential buyer. On the other hand, and Jonathan touched on some of this, what are the downsides for a potential buyer? For instance, if your customer base is primarily loyal to you, but your interest is in not being a part of the ongoing organization after a transition, what happens to the business that the buyer thought that they were acquiring? How does that transition for their plans? So again, setting the expectations.
Now, Bill, this is Jonathan here. I want to kind of interject a few things here, if you don't mind. One of the things that you've brought up is very specific. For companies and for individuals or owners who've built their title companies up over years, and they're looking for an exit strategy, they're looking for ways to sort of say, I'm going to put together my retirement plan. I will tell you, as our company relates, we are looking for people knowing this business, that it's a customer and relationship-based business. We are looking for people specifically that's going to be around for the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years, that want to put together an organized structure to turn it over to the next level. So while I know in the previous slide that you had up before that, and Jeremy had up, for people who want to leave within the next 3 months to 6 months, that's a difficult thing. That's a difficult piece to come over. Unless you have the real estate, or you have hard assets. When you're a cash flow based business and you're a customer relationship business, we're looking to keep that customer relationship business going on for the next 3 years as we slowly transition. One of the things, Bill, that maybe you can help us out with, and to the people that are on the call, specifically, we look at P&Ls, we look at profit and loss statements, we look at how the cash flow, works, or how the, for lack of better words, how the cash flow flows. So we are, and I think for the most part, for people who are looking to merge, especially for larger companies and even small to mid-sized companies, what are you looking to do in that particular scenario with how the business is going to flow to the next level? For organized businesses that have P&Ls and have balance sheets, you're already ahead of the game. For those people on the call that don't have real P&Ls, that don't have real balance sheets, my suggestion to you is go talk to a CPA. Go to them and say, here's what I'm doing. How can I make position myself better for the exit strategy? We're looking for people who want to stay on board for these next few years to slowly transition off and work that potential route. But coming up on this next slide here is, what if you're not fully retired? And this is sort of the aspect that we look at. You gotta keep going.
Excuse me. I think, Jeremy, if you go back to slide 5, it'd be great, because I have a couple points I want to interject after Jonathan on this slide. One more back. What do you want to accomplish? That one. Okay. Sorry, Jonathan.
No, go for it, Ethan. That's fine. Go ahead.
So the paradox that I see here is that if you want to fully retire, then you don't bring value to your agency as a going concern, because if most of your customer relationships are with you, how is your retiring going to help the business stay with the buyer? But if you want to semi-retire or not retire, then you get into other issues, such as, are the employees going to look to you as the owner, even though you're not really the owner? And are you on the same page as the buyer? And I think that in some of the deals that I referred to in my opening statement, that's where the friction occurred and where the deal fell apart. You can't have it both ways. For example, you can't say you're semi-retired and just going to be the sales rep going out meeting with the customers, yet be unwilling to be held accountable for a more rigorous sales program. So that's all I wanted to say, that these are the issues that would require you to be thinking way ahead, more than a month or two ahead, to figure out this and work the details out with a prospective merger partner or buyer.
Correct. Now, one of the things, Ethan, you bring up a good point. I know we have a slide coming up here in a minute. One of the things that sometimes people look for are families taking over the companies, or even staff taking over the companies. And I will tell you, at least from my perspective, a lot of them have tried. I have yet to see a real, true success story of that actually happening. Ethan, I mean, am I correct in that statement? Have you seen otherwise?
No. In fact, there's one situation right now where it's going exactly the opposite of the way you'd think. It would have been perfect for the child to take over the business, but not going to happen.
And I think that's one of the things that needs to be pointed out for most people who want to transition it to the staff, or they want to transition to the family members. What I have seen, I believe Ethan and Bill, you could probably chime in as well to this. What we have not seen is the transition, a successful transition, in that to happen to where the buyers or the next generation taking over sort of a mom and pop approach, where you're either going to have to go to another company, or looking for a company who's in another state, perhaps, who's trying to expand in that particular realm. So let's move forward here to the next slide. Is, what if you're not fully retired? Bill and I were talking about this earlier. Is, how much time are you going to devote to the agency? If you're looking to sort of break away, in what capacity are you going to break away with? I will tell you, for companies who are looking to leave, a non-compete is probably going to be a part of the situation. And more importantly, what we have to understand is, when you go to the next particular piece, next slide, is you have to look at, if you're not retiring, what's the expectations that you have to have? So really, what's the ironclad rules? First of all, the value of your business is the amount something is willing to pay for it. Just like anything else, what is something truly worth? If you have a house, if you've got a product or a car, how much is that worth? It's only worth what someone's willing to pay for it. Well, in the title world, when you are a cash flow based business, you have to have reasonable expectations. And with reasonable expectations, you can't think that your company is doing $400,000 a year and it's worth $1.2 million. So it kind of leads us into our pricing slide. And on the pricing slide that's coming up, what different types of factors do you have to consider with looking at this? First of all, it's gross revenue. Now, while I'll tell you gross revenue is great, if you can make $500,000 a month, more power to you. However, if your expenses are $600,000 or $700,000 a month, that doesn't really serve a purpose. So gross revenue is great, but you have to look at what the bottom line is. Number two, cash flow. While you may have assets and you may have everything else, if you don't have the cash flow to pay your bills, that's going to create an issue. So when people are coming on board to look at making acquisitions or looking at making mergers, you have to look at what your cash flow ability is. Number three is the bottom line. What's your net profitability? Are you taking all the net profits for yourself? Are you keeping them as retained earnings? Are you reinvesting the money back in the company? So from our perspective is, what are you doing with the net profit? And really the more important question, Bill, you can allude to this, is what really are your net profits? Do you have a third-party CPA that's coming in to look at what you're doing? Talk about discretionary earnings, but what's more important, talk about growth. I say this every single day. What is the purpose of being in business just to be in business? If you're only on board as a manager or owner to have enough revenue to pay rent and pay the bills, what's the point? You have to look at what the growth opportunities are. When we look at different companies, it's okay, well, I see this is what you're doing. What else can we do to help grow the company? Our whole role at Entrust is how to help companies succeed. Uncertainty. Well, every job is uncertain, but it is a factor to also include with that. What happens if you walk away? Are you looking out at an earnout possibility?
Jonathan, may I step in? And Jeremy, would you mind going back to slide 9? Because I want to expand on this uncertainty. And this ties back a little bit to some issues. Keep going back a couple more. One more. And Bill alluded to some of these. What this slide talks about, the downsides for the buyer. This is what uncertainty is all about. What's involved to turn around the business. Obviously, the business is good, but we don't know how good, or you might not be interested in selling. But how is the new buyer going to figure if your staff is even open to new ownership? How are they going to study your customer base? Culture clash is huge. That's something, even in the Cleveland area, we had an agent buy another agent. They were across town. And one of the huge issues was that the manager of the existing branch had to go and literally move into the other office to train the office that sold, or the selling office, to train them how to do business the buyer's way. That was the culture clash. And as always, the big mystery is, to whom are your customers loyal? Is it to your staff? Is it to the owner? Is it to the business? That's all.
Well, Ethan, you bring up a good point. One of the things that all of us have to look at, no matter if you're looking to merge or acquire or just to grow your existing agency base for the people that are on the call, more importantly is the technology angle. What I have seen historically in this industry is people are very slow to accept technology, to accept change. Unfortunately, with CFPB, it's sort of kind of ramming us down the throat. So when you are going to bring on different offices, it's the adaptation of bringing on, master technology to help create the better process. For example, if title company A is on one software program and title company B is on another, we're paying the same cost to do the same function. So we're paying twice the amount of the expense for the same functionality, and that doesn't quite work. And again, going back to our slide number 12 on the pricing spectrum, is you have to look at different strengths in the structure of how the transaction will work. Again, Ethan, I know you're in the area that you're in, and I can tell you the area that I'm in. We look at particular matters like that. Technology is the key to the future, period. Technology is a way for multiple companies in multiple areas to have access to the same files, to have access to the same software. So while you may be used to doing it in a certain value or matter, that may have to change. You may have to adapt to a better process and procedure. So again, you have to look at what the structure of the transaction is. On the next slide, we're going to talk about two different scenarios. One is asset versus going concern. I will tell everybody on the call right now, it is extremely rare. And Ethan, I know you can back me up with this. It's very rare to buy a going concern. The acquisitions for a company that used to happen a decade or more ago, where people would go in and buy a title company for X amount of dollars and walk away, those days are gone. I mean, Ethan, you can help me out with this if you see it from an underwriter perspective.
I can't even think of the last one where that happened. It's the more common issue is how close a name can we use to the existing agency where we're not going to be accused of trying to deceive customers.
And that's the thing. I think for everybody who's on this call, you have to take a look at a couple different factors. One of it is, even though what may have taken place 10, 15, 20 years ago for acquisitions, those days no longer exist. I am involved, I have a unique sort of role where I get to get involved with a lot of different business structures and acquisitions and mergers. And I'm here to tell you, when the big companies are merging into each other, there is not a whole lot of exchange of cash for the companies. That doesn't really happen because it's the uncertainty. So it sort of goes back, when we talk about the pricing, the uncertainty. What really is it worth? And then you talk about assets on the call before, on the as I said in a previous slide. Other than land and buildings, are the intangibles such as employees and customer loyalty are really an asset? If you worked up that customer service base and you have the ability to connect relationship with realtors or lenders, at the end of the day, you have to really look at what is that worth. I'm here to tell you, if I walk outside right now and I get hit by a bus, we have to take a look at that. Well, what's that loss really going to be? Or do we have a residual, or is this person just the rainmaker? And it sort of rolls us into the next slide with, do you know what's involved with winding up an agency? Let's just say an acquisition cannot be brought together. Ethan, I know you take a look at this particular slide, and we've gone over this before, but if a plan can't come together in an agreement of a purchase price or a merger with an earnout, and for people on the call, what an earnout is an acquisition that's post-paid after a certain amount of time. What options do you have?
Well, let me add a couple of things to that, Jonathan. But before we dive into that, I wanted to come back to the point that you were just making because it relates to expectation setting as we were talking about it before. You're absolutely right that things like technology may not be consistent with the technology that someone that would be acquiring a business would be using. So what that comes down to, bottom line, is some of the things that you may value as an asset, a buyer may value as a liability, because they're going to have to bear the cost of change to that infrastructure. So again, it's a matter, I think, of having the right expectation and understanding what you might be looking at. But to talk about what's involved in winding up a title agency, I think this is something that, because we do it every day, we don't really think about how complex our businesses are. It can take up to 3 years or more to wind up a title agency. And unless it's an extremely rare situation, there are both immediate things and long-term things that need to be done. If someone is going to do an asset purchase, that means that they're not going to be taking over some of the ongoing things, like issuing any policies that haven't been issued, like taking care of rejected recording packages that need to be resolved. And then you get into the whole escrow account management aspect. Some states will not allow a title company to escheat unclaimed funds to the state until a number of years go by. Well, who pays attention to that? I think that sometimes we would like to think that we could just give it back to the underwriter and let the underwriter take care of it. I believe that the underwriters would say that they are neither prepared for nor in a position to accept those responsibilities. In that case, you might need some assistance from a company that does work to help with those things. But there is a lot of work that you need to consider, even if you're transitioning for an asset purchase. The going concern or the ongoing concern will not want to take over all of the things that need to be done. So you're still left with the step of needing to wind down the operations of the other business before you can even focus your attention on the new business.
I agree. And most importantly, as the last bullet point, the tail E&O policies. If you are going to wind up your operation versus making a sale or a merger, I will tell you, being on board with an underwriter for 11.5 years, and Ethan, I'm sure you can back me up with this, the claims tail potential for an agency is 10.5 years. So when you look at tail E&O policies, that's also a cost that's going to be put into this. There are options out there, but that is just something that you can consider. So with moving on to the next slide.
I'd like to connect the dots a little bit, and both rewind and connect the dots, and then we can move on to the next slide. But I think what we're trying to illustrate here is that there's a lot more involved in the process of deciding to sell your agency and getting ready for it to be sold, even to handle the negotiations. A lot, and I think that the reason most of the deals that I referred to in my opening statement didn't take place was that the guys who wanted to sell didn't really think through the issues. And even though the initial meetings with the potential buyers were positive, once they started looking at all these details, that's when it fell apart. And the slide that we talked about a minute ago about winding up the agency, what this means and how I put this all together is, if you're thinking of exiting the business, there's a lot of homework you need to do on the front end, but you also need to consider the fact that you might not be able to get a deal done in 3 to 6 months, and you need to keep operating. Well, in order to keep operating and to keep revenue in the door, you're going to have to be best practice compliant, as well as ready to handle a new closing disclosure. So with that in mind, we can go back to the details of what's involved with getting ready to sell if you'd like to pursue that route or merge.
Well, I think it's a good point, Ethan. There's a lot involved with agencies that want to keep continuing operations with the new closing disclosure form. Now, granted, it's been pushed back to October 1st, but there's a checklist that we have compiled on the next slide, and it really kind of starts off with the confidentiality agreement. Ladies and gentlemen on the call, I'm here to tell you, do not go any further until you have some sort of NDA or confidentiality agreement that's signed. The next piece, 5 years of financials. While that's great, I also do come to the realization that that may not be possible. It may not be that you can prove or show what you've done several years ago when times were bad versus when times were good. But what you need to be aware of is you need to be able to produce profit and loss statements, balance sheets, tax returns to say, hey, I'm worth X amount of dollars. Also with that caveat is the list of expenses that are discretionary. I can't tell you, and Ethan and Bill, I'm sure you on the phone so you guys can back me up with this, is looking at expenses that are discretionary. Spouses' cars, club dues, children on payroll. We get it. We understand that, there's a lot of family values in a family-based business, but you have to be able to disclose that.
Jonathan, let me interject at this point. I had an agent who had the opposite, meaning that he was going to boost his potential profitability to a buyer by discontinuing health care to the employees. And I thought that's really going to build loyalty. That is just the wrong way to go. But
yeah, that's not a good functionality for sure. You have to. I mean, let's be honest here, guys. The most important thing to this business are the employees and the people that are part of it. You may be able to have a business, but without the lack of employees to run it, there's a problem, and vice versa. So when you look at those particular matters, it's a big deal. So going to this last bullet point is, what's your current bank account, escrow and operating? Do you have payroll accounts? Do you have a savings account? I mean, are you banking for rainy days? How does that work? On the next slide, we're going to keep going here. One of the important things that we look at is your current account escrow reconciliations. Now, in this industry, Entrust is known as the basis for third-party escrow reconciliation. So if your escrow accounts have a bunch of shortages or a bunch of problems, that could be a factor to kill a deal. I mean, if you're looking at an acquisition or merger and you're looking at $100,000 worth of shortages or deposits and transits, that will kill it. Same thing, audit reports. One of the things that we require is we want to know what the audit reports were from the underwriter. Also from any third parties. Certain states across the United States require a third-party audit. What do those look like? What are we looking at? Are we looking at a potential headache? Are we looking at a potential great merger or acquisition? Insurance policies, very, very, very important. So you have your errors and omissions insurance. Some states require Fidelity and surety bonds. Where are they? What type of terms and conditions do they have? As I said before a little bit while ago, software. Software is the key for this industry post-CFPB, period. There is no other way around it. So what type of software do you have for the file document preparation versus the file document retention periods? Equipment inventory, office furniture inventory, while they're great to have that you can post them as assets, what do they supply you with? We actually have a virtual file system where we can go back, for these digital files for a certain amount of period of time. You also need to take a look at what you can do to show them and say, hey guys, here is the time period of assets that I have. Here's also the time period of the files that I have closed. Let's go to the next slide for a second, talk about customer lists. Very important.
I'll interject here, John. This is an extremely sensitive part of the process where Jonathan had mentioned the non-disclosure or confidentiality agreement is what really comes into this section of the outline. You're basically going to be revealing to a potential buyer all your business. And you certainly don't want to be in a situation where you feel they're just going to take that and then run and start attacking your customers.
That's correct. So, and again, this goes back to the non-disclosure agreement or confidentiality agreement that's signed. You want to be able to protect yourself if a deal goes south, that they're not going to go after who your customer base is. But during that process, you also have to be willing to give forth the average amount of orders per month. Just because you have orders doesn't necessarily mean it actually will equate to amount of closing. So you have to look at it as well too. What is your average amount of new orders? What is your average amount of closings per month? What's your average premium charge and cancellation rate? And that's kind of a big point. You can open as many orders as you want. If your orders don't become closings, they basically are becoming cancellations. What a cancellation is that you are spending the time and effort of developing a closing, processing the closer, but if it doesn't fall through, no revenue is generated, which means it's a lost cause. In Florida, they just got done with the data call. And for people who are outside of the state of Florida on this call, in the data call, we had to show how many closings were originated, how many closings closed, how many closings canceled, what the cost and income revenue would have been for both, just because of what the title insurance premium rates are. The other big key factor is residential versus commercial. I know a lot of title companies are heavy in residential and a lot of law firms are heavy in commercial. But again, you have to be able to break out what the difference are. Also, the very last bullet point, which I think Ethan helped me with, is the breakout of the above information for each of your top 5 customers. I'm sure everybody on this call has heard of the 80-20 rule. 80% of your revenue comes from the top 20% of your clients. So while you may focus on the lower 80%, the top 20% is what actually produces the revenue. So you have to be able to say, here's who my people are, and again, you are covered by the non-disclosure agreement you had previously signed, but it also takes you sort of into the next slide, is getting all the information ready to go. So a detailed employee list. Names, simple enough. Duties, simple enough. Years of employment. I'm going to stop on this bullet point for a second because it is very, very important. You can hire people, they come and go within the first few months. If you've got employees that have been with you 2, 3, 5, 10 years, that's something to be said. That means that they value their job, that they know what they're doing. But on the flip side of that coin, they also have to be able to adapt to the new CFPB rules. So it asks the question, is there an employment contract in place? I can tell you from a buyer's perspective, we're looking for that. If we have an acquisition, if we have a merger, how much longer is this employee who does a good job, are they in place? Salary range, licensing, any type of bonus incentive programs. We have to be able to understand if you're going to do 100 closings, if we've got to pay bonus and incentives on 80% of them, what does that equate to in expenses? Same thing for vacation and sick time. Do you have the adequate amount of staff to work with a potential, sick time where we have adequate overflow? If somebody leaves to go on vacation, leaves to go on sick time, do we have other people in place to help, offset that?
I'd like to back on one of the points that you raised when you were talking before about the escrow accounts. And that's one thing that can sometimes be a surprise to people. Just because you reconcile through your software, just because your underwriter has accepted those reports, does not necessarily mean that there aren't potential liabilities in there. Not every title and closing software package has the same tracking capability or the same monitoring capability. So one of the things that you might want to do as part of your preparation is make sure that you understand exactly what those reports are telling you. Do you, for instance, have held escrow funds for things like work completion escrows that should have been released 3 years ago, look good because they're being carried on the reports as positive balance, but the reality is that there's a liability issue there. That money should have been returned to someone long ago. So making sure that you understand exactly what your reports are telling you and finding out whether you've got any potential pitfalls is another area that you might want to focus on.
And I think at this point in the hour, since we're running short on time, let's just take a quick look at slide number 19. And this just says, in essence, to get a list of all your contracts together. Every contract you have, leases, underwriting contracts, etc. A claims report from an underwriter is also critical. But let's move on then. Jeremy, to the next slide, Plan B. What to do if you can't put a deal together? What are the issues that we need to address here?
And along with the issues, one of the things that I think has to be factored into that is we are 94 days by my count away from October 1st. So the time frame in which to do anything is relatively brief.
Definitely. All right, the next slide. Bill, I thought that it might be good for you to start this one out, but on the winding down, is that really a viable option? And Jonathan on the upgrading operations to make the agency viable, profitable. So, Bill, why don't you start?
Okay. Winding down certainly is a viable operation. If that's something that you wish to do, then we've already gone through some of the thoughts on what you might want to consider to do that. The understanding that you'd need would be that it is going to take a period of time to do it, and it could be a potential significant amount of work. If you're not interested in plowing through it, then you might want to find someone that can help you with that. But there are a lot of steps to be completed winding down the operation so that you can walk away knowing that everything is taken care of, is certainly one of the options that you could consider.
I think it's fair to say from the underwriter's perspective that you can't deliver your agency over to the underwriter, that's not an option. You can't bring boxes of files over to your local agency operation and say it's your problem now. There are state licensing regulatory obligations that you assumed when you formed the agency, and just by dropping the files off, which people have done, by the way, does not relieve you of those.
So Ethan, you're telling me you don't want to take a bunch of files?
I don't want. It's worse now with the NPI. Jonathan, how about let's talk about upgrading operations, best practices, workflow improvements. What do you recommend there, and what are you seeing?
Sure. For companies that want to want to continue to stay on board, or if they want to potentially upgrade everything to get things done, first and foremost is technology. The electronic recording of documents. Getting documents recorded within 24 hours. A software system that can do multiple facets, not just create a HUD. You have to look at those particular factors. Best practices, quite honestly, is the key. The American Landfill Association, Jeremy, who's been on the call, created the 7 pillars of best practices of what companies need to strive for, and all different types of how a closing takes place, with how you protect, different people's information. Not necessarily you have to be certified by an independent third party, but you have to be well on your way for best practices, in a sense that you're doing what needs to be done for the protection of the customers, which is very important. But more also important is the protection for your own company. And also the last bullet point, which is the workflow improvements. Efficiencies is the key. Efficiency, efficiency, efficiency. If the same person is doing multiple jobs and they're here and there, and there's an old terminology of you're so busy cutting wood, no one takes time to sharpen the axe. That's a critical piece. So creating a basic foundation, a concrete foundation, is what's going to make your company successful versus a company that nobody wants to take a look at.
Right, and I think that Plan B should be something that has a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. Let's say you can't put a deal together now. There's no reason you can't work on Plan B as far as upgrading your operations and best practices, with the goal of making your agency more suitable for a merger or acquisition.
Correct.
And something that Jonathan said before about the importance of technology. I've been getting phone calls.
Hey, Bill.
Or so. Yep.
Hey, this is Jeremy. You're awful. Your audio is pretty light. Could you turn up your volume or speak a little louder?
Sorry. I've been getting phone calls over the past month or so from people who are hearing from their software providers that their software is not upgradable to deal with the CFPB changes that are coming along. So if you are considering making the investment to prepare your operation to go forward, one of the very first things you might want to consider is just making sure that the technology that you've got is capable of moving in that direction.
And that's a very good point. I'm not trying to throw anybody under the bus here, so what I'm gonna be very broad with what I'm about to say is, I have heard there are several software providers that are struggling to have the closing disclosure forms done by the implementation date. On top of that, I have heard that there is a difficulty with creating the portal for lenders to communicate effectively to the title companies. And again, just because you can have secure email doesn't necessarily mean that the lender can accept your secure email. So Ethan and Bill, I know we talked about this earlier, just because you have the ability to do certain functions, that may not work. A fax machine, sending it by fax, Ethan, I know we talked about this a minute ago.
Right.
A fax may not work because do you have a secure line? The fax machines retain hard drives. So you have the sender's fax machine and the recipient's fax machine that have a hard drive that can have NPI. So again, there is a technology aspect of how do you communicate effectively with the lenders in regards to TRID, but also how do you deal with the realtors that come into play saying, why can't I just email this to you?
I think there's clearly a lot involved in trying to get ready for best practices in the closing disclosure. And at this point in time in that calendar of 94 days, it's very difficult to now decide you want to consider merging or selling. And it would have to be a miracle for a deal to take place in the next 94 days. That being said, though, I think the materials here outline a series of things you can do and a series of things you can think about that can make your agency and exit strategy viable. Unfortunately, in the meantime, while you're doing all that homework, you're going to have to figure out how to keep it in operation, up through and past October 1st. Jeremy, at this point, I believe we're ready for questions.
All right, Ethan, sounds great. Thank you guys for some great information on exit strategies. I thought the checklist is very helpful on helping frame up what agency owners need to do to get ready. During the course of the webinar, we did get a question that, well, that really isn't a question, it's more just kind of an observation. And Alberta's comment was, the message I'm getting is that a successful sale is not possible in today's world. Sound like you're kind of alluding to maybe that the next few months maybe not possible, but while you're running your operation, get things ready for a sale, and maybe after the implementation of TRID, maybe you'll see some things happen. Is that what you're saying?
I'd like to jump on that one. That's an excellent comment, and I would say that in one of the agents I was talking with earlier this year and late last year, this person had basically been on a retirement plan and had been letting the agency slowly shrink, got down to about 2 or 3 employees, and then he decided, well, I think it's time for me to sell. Well, by that time, though, of course, knowing that retirement and a sale date was scheduled for December 31st in his mind, a lot of things had slipped, meaning there was not much new customer acquisition going on, very little or no technology upgrades going on. So yes, it was very hard. In fact, no sale did take place because what is there to sell? An agency that's way behind the 8 ball on best practices and way behind the 8 ball on a customer pipeline.
I agree with Ethan. You know, you have to make your agency in tip-top shape. And for, you know, I was on the phone earlier today with a title company who felt safe and secure at, you know, 20, 25 deals a month. I've got these larger title companies and law firms that are merging, you know, that are scared. You really need to have a very good self-evaluation. You need to look at the perspective from a 30,000-foot view. You know, is this worthwhile to somebody else? You know, is this industry what I want to be in for the next 6 months, a year, 3 years, 5 years? You know, if you can answer those simple questions, you're much further along than anybody else. If you're just kind of, and Ethan, I hate to say this, if you're kind of sort of just hanging out and sliding around and not necessarily putting forth the infrastructure or best practices implementation into place, the only person you're hurting is really yourself. And that's not what this is designed to do. This is designed to look at what you can do to benefit yourself in the next years to come.
All right, thanks guys. Real quick, I also had a question about the non-disclosure agreements. Robert was wondering if where it could get a sample of one, or if you guys, any of the speakers, could help them out.
Sure, that's easy. Just give me the information on the side, Jeremy.
Okay. All right, Michael. We'll connect you with. Was that Ethan?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Earlier during the presentation, you guys were talking about assets, and Stephen was wondering how title plants and back title policies should be calculated into assets.
Bill, would you like to try that one?
Well, I think it depends a lot on where you're at. If you're in a title plant state, then obviously a title plant is a significant asset. If you're in a state that is primarily title policy rather than abstract oriented, and there are online title plant services available, then a plant may not be worth as much, because whoever is acquiring may not be interested in continuing to maintain the thing. So part of it is going to be where you're at. The same thing with policy libraries. If you're in a state like Florida where the underwriters maintain the policy library on behalf of their agent base, then yours may not be a significant asset. Same thing is true if it's easy to search the plant records online from a service, and depending on the percent of market you had, having a policy library may not be a significant benefit. Jonathan, what are you seeing with some of the companies that you've looked at for acquiring?
You know, it's an interesting dynamic. I mean, I really think you sort of hit the nail on the head. It really depends upon where you're at. And, you know, I'm actually in Orlando, Florida. And in Florida, there's a heavy basis for technology and what have you, comparison to other states where you have a prior policy or a back title plant. There is a definitive asset for that. So I think, again, it's very, you know, regional in a sense that you look at what's available to you. And at that particular juncture, you can make a level, an educated level guess of what is that particular company or plant worth. So I think it's very, you know, geographically located on what needs to be done with that particular juncture.
All right. Hey, guys, we're at the top of the hour, but I'd still like to answer a few more questions, if you don't mind, hanging out for a few more minutes. Dan had a question about, and I hope I enunciate correctly, EBITDA. That's probably not right, EBITDA. If you guys maybe want to explain it in case some people aren't familiar with that term. But do you have some guidance on multiples on income that you've experienced or seen?
I would
I'm going
say,
to jump in on that one, and then I'll defer to Jonathan and Ethan. I think that that's sometimes an unfortunate yardstick that people use for the reasons that Jonathan identified earlier. Earnings are a function of your role in your operation, the customer loyalty that people have to you, and what your intended role is in the future organization. And I don't know that a multiple of earnings is a valid yardstick without taking into consideration those other factors, like, are you going to remain in the business?
Yeah, that's a good definition. It's an interesting question, Jeremy. So what you have to look at is a couple different factors. First and foremost is, I hear people say, it's 3 times gross revenue. I don't know whoever came up with that rule, or 2 times gross revenue, but when you're in a cash flow based business, and the business is based upon customer relationship, if that person who develops that revenue leaves and there's nothing left, I will tell you, as a person who does buying and acquisition and mergers, I would be left with a bunch of copier leases and rent and payroll. That doesn't serve a functionality of what it's worth. So there's sort of 2 different features to consider. So going back to Bill's slide a while back, when you look at an exit strategy, if somebody's looking to get out in the next 3 months, 6 months, a year, I don't see that happening. It doesn't. I will tell you from my perspective, it doesn't serve a purpose. A successful company, and I'll use this from what was told to me, a successful company is where a company can operate without an individual running the show, the owner running the show. So if there is contractual obligations in place where a certain amount of volume of business is going to come in the door, then yes, that can be attributed to that type of earnings. But other than that, if it's just a regular cash flow based business, I just don't see, if they're looking to exit, how that would work properly without some sort of earn-out type of acquisition.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Jonathan. Probably not a question that could have been answered quickly. So, 2 more that have been kind of a common theme that have been asked. One is about family-owned companies, and why are these companies failing when passed on to family members? Any insight into what you're seeing in this area?
well, let me jump in. The one that I'm familiar with was a case of more or less absentee ownership. So the parent owner delightfully handed over the daily operation to the child and then kind of disappeared like an absentee owner. And that's great to give someone all the responsibility, but when they can't make the ownership decisions, it leads to, disgruntled's a bad word, but bad feelings and burnout, to use simple terms, and a loss of interest in investing years of life into an operation that they couldn't really control. So that's one scenario.
All right. And then just one more question here, and if we didn't get to your question, please feel free to reach out to any of the speakers. Their email addresses are there on the screen now. Just to wrap up, one final thought that several had asked is, what liability does a company owner have if they just simply shut the doors?
I'll let Ethan take that. From the underwriter perspective. From the state perspective, they're probably looking at funds handling requirements from the state, because if they have unclaimed funds, which would be held escrow funds or completion escrows, that type of thing, they're looking at escheatment laws that are going to have to be dealt with. They can't just walk away from that. The rules and laws, and I'm not an attorney, I will defer to those who are, but the rules and laws regarding escrow accounts are pretty specific, and at the very least, you cannot just walk away from that escrow account.
I would say on the policy side that from an underwriter's perspective, under our standard contract, we would have the ability to collect damages, and damages, roughly speaking for this purpose, would include monies spent by us to accomplish your contractual obligations.
And then to the extent, to add to that, that you have non-public information in your possession, such as all of those files, I would expect that legally you'd be required to prove that you have disposed of that properly.
Yeah, it's the kind of question we don't like to hear asked. None of the answers are good.
All right. Well, maybe to wrap up, if any of you guys have any parting thoughts, maybe on a little bit more upbeat tone. Otherwise, we'll wrap up today's call.
Yeah, I would like to, my opening comment for a closing statement would be that if you take these checklist items and do the things necessary to get your business in tip-top shape for a potential sale, you're going to invariably increase your profitability, and you might energize your staff and inspire somebody to step up to the plate to say, hey, this really is a viable business. Let's make it work.
And you don't necessarily have to feel that walking away from it is your only option. There are options for people to help you do the things that you need to do to wrap things up in an orderly fashion.
That is correct. I mean, Bill can help that side. There's a lot of people on this call here that can help you with that potential piece. I guess it's more along the lines of identifying what you really want to do. How long do you want to be in this? For what time period? What type of role do you want to play? Once you identify those pieces, then everything else will fall into place.
All right. Thanks, guys. And again, please feel free to reach out to any of the speakers. They can definitely help you out, or can find someone who can help you feel a little bit more confident about your situation. As a reminder, if you missed parts of today's webinar, or if you think others in your office would benefit from listening, a recording of the presentation will be available after we've edited the file, and it will be uploaded on Alta's website on the Title Topics archives at alta.org/Title Topics. Looking ahead, our next webinar in July will focus on the other side of the transaction, and we'll be sharing information on how to evaluate a company to buy if you're thinking about growing your footprint. In August, we will turn to implementation of the integrated disclosures. I'm sure everyone has heard by now that the CFPB proposed pushing back the effective date of the regulations until October 3rd. So that's going to give the industry a little bit more time to get prepared. And that webinar will focus on items that may come up at the closing table, as well as post-closing issues when handling transactions involving the closing disclosure. In the meantime, if you're looking for more information about the integrated disclosures, please go to Alta's website at alta.org/CFPB. And with that will bring us to the conclusion of today's presentation. Thank you again, Bill, Ethan, Jonathan, for joining us today and sharing some information about exit strategies. And I hope all the listeners found today's presentation useful. Take care, everyone.